This episode of Beyond the Post is made possible by Riverside.fm. Riverside is a remote recording platform designed to make it easy to create professional quality podcasts, video interviews, and other forms of content, even when participants are in different locations. Riverside offers basic editing tools, automatic transcriptions, and the ability to export recordings for further editing in other software. You can sign up a free trial to Riverside.fm where you'll get 2 hours of multi-track recordings per month, a full suite of editing tools, and more by heading over to beyondthepost.fm/Riverside. Once again, that's beyondthepost.fm/Riverside.
Hi, Rob.
What's going on, sir?
Well, it's been a wonderful day, Rob. Got nothing to complain about. Nothing whatsoever. How about you?
I'm not going to complain either. So Bodie, you and I, here's what we're doing right now. So folks who are tuned into this, Bodie and I are literally sitting together, putting together a rundown or a run of show that we're going to record a bit later. And we thought this would be good bonus content for you folks who just kind of want to see how the sausage is made, to watch the two of us go through actually putting a show together. Now we've come to this. We've got a few notes that each of us have, as far as ideas of what we want to do. But really, this is about as inside baseball as you can get.
So, Rob, we have two options today that you and I both started to run down, and we'll definitely use both of these. Which one do you want to go with? You want to go with tactical tips or content calendar?
So here's a question. For a between the post episode, do we want to have one major topic that we talk about for the entire 25, 30 minutes that we go? Or do you want to, does it depend on the topics that we have? Do we want to break that up into 2 or 3 specific conversations with breakpoints? How do you want to attack that? Because I can see this 2 ways. We probably have enough content in each one of these, depending how deeply we could go. We can make each one of them probably a 20, 25 minute episode. Mm-hmm. Or we can not go necessarily as deep, and then we can literally have a couple of segments where we talk about 2 or 3 different things and give each one of those things 8 to 10 minutes.
In today's episode, or just in general?
In general, I think that's how episodes can go. So this could be, today we decide to do one thing. Another day, just based off of the type of show that we're creating, it may make sense to do something else. So yeah, you for content calendar, you went fairly deep in this. I would imagine that we could hold darn near an entire show with just content calendar. Mm-hmm. If you wanted to do that. Or like I said, or we could start recording it and see and play it by ear. It's like, there's so many different ways that we can go about this, but the conversations are very different. Content calendar is one thing. Tactical tips on what you should do day one. It's related in the sense that a content calendar might be one of those things that you get to tactically, but that's probably going to be like thing 11 or 12. I don't think that's going to be thing number 1. Actually come up with a premise for your show.
Sure. I for today's show, because I think it adds, maybe we could do this again, but I think for today's show, tactical tips, because when I logged into the doc or the sheets last night, I was like, oh, that's a really good idea. And I just threw what I had in my head before I went to bed. I just put that down because I didn't want to lose it. Mm-hmm. So I'm okay with going over tactical tips, because I think that adds a little bit. I think that's going to be more helpful for folks listening who might be setting a rundown for their own show.
Right. So let me tell you how I arrived at that topic title. I was listening to someone saying, it's like, hey, I keep hearing people say, well, here's what you would do. And it's all this ethereal stuff. And we kind of did that last week, but I don't know what to do first. What do I do if I want to start? And for them, it wasn't even a podcast. They wanted to start a YouTube channel. What is thing number 1 that you, Mr. YouTuber, who have been doing this for however many years and now make over $100,000 a year doing it? What is the first thing you do when you start a new channel? I don't want to hear the pie in the sky thing. It's like, tell me to go do something. Is it create a email address? Is, what is the thing that actually gets done? I'm like, I'm wired that way. I want to know step by step what kind of things can I do. So that's where I started coming, coming at this. And one of the things though is that, well, clearly the first thing, if somebody says, I want to start a podcast, I'm going to give you, just some inside information from what I have noticed. I tend to find that people who tell me they want to start a podcast, but don't know what they want to start a podcast about before they tell me they want to start a podcast, they're the ones that are going to be in that 90% that don't make it past episode 3. And I hate to, I don't want to generalize, because there clearly are some who that is not the case for. But if you're looking at the numbers, most people who come to, I want to create a podcast. Well, what do you want to create a podcast about? I have no idea. I just want it to be good. That generally is the person that's going to create the show, decides to cancel the show by about the end of episode 2.
So, Rob, I used to create iPhone apps. They weren't very good iPhone apps, but I have a friend who's a programmer. He's a really, really good programmer. So we would put together these iPhone apps really early on, like 2007, 2008, whenever the App Store came out. And then I would get people who would come up to me and be like, you should write an app for this. Not knowing that all of the work that goes behind it, not knowing the amount of money that could potentially go behind it. And then they want to split the idea of the app money 50-50 because they come up with the idea. That's the kind of thing. You can have a great idea, but if you don't have the ability to implement that idea, it's that's all it is. It's a great idea.
When people ask me, it's like, hey, I want to create a podcast. What should I create a podcast on? I generally will tell them something like pneumono ultrasonic microscopic siliconovolcanoconiosis, which is the longest word in the English language. All right. And then they'll look at me like, what are you talking about? And it's like, how am I going to tell you what you should create a podcast on? So that's why I have in our document, define your premise. But as a consultant, I don't really get into helping you define your premise, because that's kind of like saying, I look at somebody saying that I want to start a podcast. Help me. What do I do? But they haven't even come up with the premise for the podcast. Is no different than somebody saying, I want to start a business. Well, what do you want to start a business on? I have no idea. I just know I want to be a business person. So I'm not saying that person can't succeed. I just think that person has to take a step back and really understand what problem are you trying to solve. So I don't know how much I put into define your premise, because for me personally, that's just not an area where I want to live. And that's just a me thing. You may have a completely different take on it. So what is your thought about defining your premise for a show? And, what would you tell someone tactically that they can do when they're trying to figure that out?
I had people in my podcast that I do, that I've done for over 7 years, ask, hey, can you talk about this, or could you do this? And I have my podcast is about electric vehicles, renewable energy, and autonomous driving. If I can find a reason to incorporate what they're suggesting into those 3 things, then I'll talk about it. But if I can't, then it's not something that I will talk about as a general rule, because it's just, that's not some, I don't know how else to put this, that it's outside of the scope. Like I'm not going to talk about, like I don't talk about hybrids. But if for some reason something really cool comes up in hybrid technology, I might mention it, but it's not a focus. Does that make sense?
No, it makes absolute sense, because it's making me think of something. And this is just a note that I want to actually take here for, another show. If we ever talk about guest hosting, not guest hosting, making a guest appearance. You're not, being a guest on someone else's show. I believe that one of the ways to grow your audience the fastest without actually necessarily having to spend money to do so is to literally show up on other people's shows who have similar audiences. I don't want to say exact audiences, because then you're kind of competing, but similar audiences. And be able to talk about what you talk about to those audiences and be compelling to them. So I look at what you just said the same way. Somebody might say, hey, can you talk about this? Well, if it just doesn't make sense for you, then it doesn't make sense for you. It's the same thing. I was having a conversation with a young man, probably not a month ago. And he was like, well, yeah, I've guested on like 10 shows in like the last month. But then when we actually went back and looked at the 10 shows, none of the 10 shows had anything to do with what he talks about. He was literally just a guest on shows talking about, I don't want to say random, topics, because the topics were apropos to the show. They just weren't necessarily apropos to what he was doing. So the focus was, okay, well, let's see if we can't get you onto a show where you can talk about what you talk about on your podcast, that somebody might say, oh, let me go check that out, because it's a topic that is related to what they're there to get. And I think that you're kind of saying the same thing. You want to stick to topics that are apropos to what you talk about, and where you have that level of comfortability. Am I getting that? Or
yeah, I was talking to somebody and they were talking about having a podcast about their life, and they're no more interesting than I am. Now, they may have something interesting to say, right? But I don't know how you make that into a show that spans multiple years for random people who don't know you.
A token phrase of mine is that your show existing is not a reason for someone to listen. So when you tell me I want to make a show about my life, the question is, who is that show going to be? Who are you targeting with that show? Why should they listen to what you have to say? Why are you the one to deliver that message? And ultimately, what are they going to get out of it when they walk away from having listened to the show? And usually when for folks who are saying, oh, I want to create a show about my life, that isn't necessarily what comes out of the other end. And I've had people even argue and say, well, people write autobiographies and stuff like that all the time. And it's like, yes, but there's generally a compelling story as to why they wrote it. Not to be dismissive of anyone's story, but I don't care about the neighbor who lives, 11 houses down the street, across the street, across the ravine, from the next person in that way, to where I just want to go read their story because they have a story to be read. There's got to be some compelling reason, there's got to be some struggle that they overcame that I can associate myself with, that I can see myself in that situation. It's like, oh, okay, I want to see how they got out of it. Just the fact that you have a diary that you've kept in a online journal called a podcast or a YouTube channel, or you've written it down, on a blog post or whatever the case is not a reason for somebody else to read it. So or to read it, to consume it, to watch it, to listen to it, whatever the case would be.
And I agree with you, but I will counter your point just by saying, if you want to leave something behind for your kids or grandkids, and you want to do something like that, I think that's a good reason to do that. The Internet Archive sucks up all this data, so if you don't know how to store it, or you're not sure they'll get it, but they may want to find it one day or whatever, that might be a reason to do it. But beyond that
brings us back circle to the first question. Define the premise. What is the premise of your show? Why does your show exist? What are you creating it for? So those are the things that we kind of just did it in live, because this is how we always have our conversations. We go on these wild tangents and eventually bring it back. But in defining your premise, you basically should be able to tell folks, here's what my show is about. Here's who I'm creating it for. Here's why you should listen to me talk to you about it. And here's what you're going to get out of it if I do. If you cannot do that in your premise, then you might want to go back and rethink it, because, the thing is that, when you create this content, people are going to pay for it. And, when they consume it, they're paying with their time and their attention to actually consume the content. So I always try to say, well, I want to make sure that if someone is going to pay time and attention to consume my content, there's going to be something that they get on it on the back end. And I think that's what your premise ultimately is going to be. And as I said, I generally don't get into trying to, okay, well, tell me what you like. Tell me what tell me what your hobbies are and these kind of things, and coming up with, a premise for you. Because when I did do that, I just found that those were the shows that shut down the quickest. Just because, one of the things that we can talk about, the bar to entry to podcasting is relatively low. It does not cost a lot. And I'm not necessarily talking about money. I'm just talking about it doesn't cost you a lot of time. It doesn't cost you a lot of effort to create that first piece of content when you decide, hey, I want to record something today, and then tomorrow you're recording. So because of that, it's real easy to walk away from something after an episode or two. And it's like, that was fun for the time I did it. I'm going to move on to the next thing. And it was why we see so many podcasts fail. I believe the statistic is 10% of podcasts make it past episode 3, and only about 1% make it past episode 20. I literally just posted that, on Threads earlier today. So basically, be flexible in what you're going to talk about, because what you may want to talk about may not be the thing that resonates with your audience. But also, you really want to hone in on what you are doing the show for. And even saying that, Bodie, that's not necessarily tactical. So I wanted to get into some of these other things. So tactical things that we can do after you have created your premise. You know what your show is going to be about. I'm just thinking the first thing you probably want to do is come up with the name for the show, because that's going to tie into what your premise is. And you want to go out and find out what names are available before you get too far down the road. So I'm literally saying determine what the name of your show is going to be. And, you want to go out and secure those socials. And I say, secure pretty much all of them, because it doesn't take you enormous amounts of time to do that. Even if you don't plan on posting on LinkedIn, you probably should have a LinkedIn account. Even though you don't plan on posting on Instagram, you probably should have an Instagram account, because you just don't want someone else to be able to come and grab that social where you've actually built up a name for yourself in some other area.
I don't want to give too much away, because I don't know when we're going to play Sierra and Maria's interview that we did with them. But I would, like Rob said, I would secure all of that stuff, but figure out where your audience is on all of those platforms. If your audience is mostly on Threads, concentrate on Threads. If you're doing a business podcast, concentrate on LinkedIn. I think that's a pretty easy thing to do. Did you want to go over how you and I came up with the name of our show, and then the epiphany that we had last week?
Yeah, that's probably a good one. I'll let you start, because you had the initial name of the show.
Yeah, so Rob and I reached out to Rob and I said, hey, I got this idea for a show where we interview content creators and just help build a community for people who want to do this kind of thing. And so we all support each other. Rob's like, that's great. What do you want to call it? I'm paraphrasing, because we talk way longer than that. But I said, Behind the Post. And Rod came back a couple weeks later and he's like, I like Beyond the Post. What do you think of that? And that's way better, right? And then last week,
there's a reason for that. So the reason that I said I liked Beyond the Post is because we are able to get top level domains for Beyond the Post. Behind the Post, there are 1,911 shows that are named Behind the Post. So that was part of it. There were no good, clearly you weren't going to get behindthepost.com. But the other thing is that when you talked about Behind the Post, much of it was not talking about podcasting. It was when you would type that in, you would find stuff about literally like people who are selling post diggers, building decks, those kind of things. There was nothing that was podcast or content related to it. But that's the content that came up. And even though Beyond the Post generated some of the same types of searches, it wasn't nearly as much. And there were top level domains that were available.
Yeah. Behindthepost.com, I think, was just a picture of a fence post.
Literally.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm pulling it up right now, but it doesn't look like it's maybe live anymore. So, yeah. So we had Behind the Post, which is like behind the music, is where that kind of came from. And then we had, what was the next one?
Beyond the Post. And that's what we actually decided to go with. So we registered that domain name, went out and got the socials for everything, created email accounts. So that is the ultimate name of the show. And then last week we kind of had that bit of an epiphany.
Yeah. So the original concept for the show is we'd have like 6 episodes and they would all be interviews. Well, as Rob and I, as we went through this, we were like, you know what? We kind of like talking to each other about this stuff. Why don't we create in between episodes where you and I just chat. And then last week, Rob came up with Between the Post, which was genius. And I'm not sure if it seemed like it was on accident. Maybe it was planned out, but it fit. I got chills. The hairs on my arm stood up. I don't have hairs on my head. Otherwise, they probably would have stood up.
Yeah, that's it was just one of those things like, man, I just thought of something. The name of the show is still Beyond the Post. That is what we are ultimately branding. But these episodes, what do we call them? Well, these are in between the things that we normally do. So let's call them Between. And then we kept having conversations. And you were saying, you know what? We need to put some stuff behind the paywall. And I'm like, oh, wow. That's what's going to be behind the post. So we now have Beyond the Post, which is the primary domain name. Everything else will revert back to that. Then our in between episodes will be Between the Post, and then our behind the scenes episodes that we only are offering to our patrons or folks who ultimately are who are members of our community. Those are going to be Behind the Post, which brings it full circle to that was the first domain name that you actually came up with for the name of the show. So I just thought that was kind of cool. But anyway, relating it back to this, tactical things that we do when we start a podcast, right after what your premise is, what your podcast is going to be about, you want to get on figuring out what the name of your show is going to be very, very early on, because so many other things are going to come from that. As we said, you want to, once you know what your title is going to be, go out, register that domain name, go secure the socials and all the top social media platforms, and you may not get it exactly like you want it, but whatever you do, just make sure you can get it. You want to have the same, at on Instagram, the same at on Threads, the same at on X, the same at on TikTok. If you can do those four, and LinkedIn is a little different, but if you can get at least those 4 or 5, you pretty much have gotten most of them. For some folks, if you have an audience on Mastodon, create those ones there. If you have an audience on Blue Sky, create those there as well. But you definitely want to get the big ones out of the way fairly early on. Because the third thing that's going to come at this stage is that once you have your title, once you've secured your socials, now you've got to start worrying about your artwork. And Bodie, I'm going to let you talk not exclusively, but deeply about coming up with artwork, because you have basically, taken care of, all that work for Beyond the Post. So once you know your title, once you have secured your socials, how do tell the folks how we actually came up with artwork for our show.
The good people at OpenAI came up with the artwork for our show. We used artificial intelligence. We used DALL-E 3, I think it's up to now. And I just put in there, I was like, here's the premise of our show. I need 10 options for artwork. And it gave me 10 terrible ones. And then I just continued asking for more options as we continued whittling down the process. And once I was done, I just showed them to Rob, and Rob was like, I like this one. And that's the one we went with. And I'm trying to find on my desktop where if I can pull this up so people can see it, but I don't see it anywhere. But you can also use Fiverr. You can also use Upwork.com. If you happen to know an artist, you can use, them. It's the window into your show. It's the first thing they see. So if you are doing a show about exercise and you have a picture of your 1969 Ford Mustang on the front of your podcast, because your artwork, because you're really proud of your Mustang, that's not going to bring people in. And that goes for all types of content creation.
So one thing that I will say about artwork, one thing that I will say about the name of your show, if you can avoid it, do not put a podcast microphone as the main attraction in your podcast artwork, and do not put the word podcast in the title of your show. If you think about it, television shows rarely have the name show in it. Some do, but it's pretty rare. If you're watching, CSI, the name of the show is, Crime Scene Investigation. It is not Crime Scene Investigation hourly television show. So I think that there is a habit for, particularly with podcasters, to actually put the such and such and such podcast in the name of the show. Now, there is a reason for that, because if you go back, Bodie, I did my first podcast in 2006. People didn't know what podcasts were in 2006. So putting the name in the podcast, like, the longest running podcast that I have been doing that, some friends of ours, cause you know them as well, we've been running a show since 2008. The name of that show has the word podcast in it because we were telling people back in 2008 what the show was, so that they would actually, oh, okay, this is a podcast. I need to go listen to it on my iPod, or I need to figure out a way of how to download this and listen to it on the computer. But I know what it is based off of the name. If we were renaming that show today, there is no way that we will put podcast into it, because that actually kind of limits you, because you could start off today where you are an audio only podcast, but a year from today, you might actually be a YouTube, channel. You might be doing live streaming. You never know. One of the things you said when we were defining our premise is be flexible. You want to be flexible in the naming of your show as well, because what your show is today may not be what it is tomorrow. So you don't want to lock yourself into something that is so strategic that you have to actually do a complete rebrand when you get to a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, whatever the case is. So I just say, do not put the word podcast in your show. You will rarely ever see somebody put the word YouTube in your show. That's even worse, because that's a trademark name, and, Google will come after you on that if your show gets big. But you rarely ever see that. People rarely refer to themselves, my YouTube show. They will just say their show on YouTube. It sounds like there's a distinction without a difference, but no, they are different things. A show on YouTube can also be on TikTok, can also be on Instagram, Reels, can also be on whatever private hosting, membership community that you have. But if your show is a YouTube show, it can only exist on YouTube by the nature of the fact that you called it a YouTube show. So, I'm a stickler for that. Try not to put the word podcast into your show when you can avoid it, and try not to actually use a podcast microphone as the main attraction in your show. There are times when it makes okay, I see why they did this. I see where they went with it. And when you look at our podcast artwork, you'll say, oh, okay, I see what they were doing there. But usually if the podcast microphone is the main attraction in the podcast artwork, you're hamstringing yourself by letting people know exactly what you are today. And that may not be what you are tomorrow.
Yeah. And I think that's a very good point. I'll do another counterpoint, right? My podcast is called Kilowatt. If you type in Kilowatt into Google, you do not get my podcast. You get a bunch of other stuff that has nothing to do with electric vehicles. If I did it on my logged in Google accounts, I'd probably get my show. But if somebody else that had nothing to do with my show and wanted to look it up, if they typed in Kilowatt, it's probably not going to get it. So my show does say Kilowatt Podcast. However, I have thought about, I'm well known enough now, just taking that podcast part out. I just haven't done it to this point. But in order for me to get somewhat found in Google, I had to do that. But if you type in electric vehicle podcasts now or Tesla podcast now, my show does come up. So it's probably not as important, but early on it was a little bit more important. And it was also 2016.
I was going to say, so your show's been around for a while. Back then, you didn't really hear people say, "Oh, don't put the name podcast in your show." This is really a post-pandemic thing, because during the pandemic, everybody came out with whatever name they thought was cool podcast. Sure. Whatever, whatever show you think is cool podcast. I've actually seen shows that actually had the word show and podcast in the same show, in the same title. And it's kind of like, all right, that is getting played out. So, but yeah, I get what you're saying. And I'm going to talk completely out of the other side of my mouth. Although your show should not, in my opinion, be named something podcast. If you actually use search engine optimization to where, I'll just throw an example and do some self-promotion. The Tech John, we never refer to it as a podcast, but I do all kind of search engine optimization. So if you type in the Tech John podcast, it will be the first thing that comes up. Even though when it comes up, it's just going to be podcast artwork, my name and my host name. You don't really see the word podcast anywhere, but I know that that's how people will search for it. So I'm doing that from a search engine optimization standpoint. It's just that the show itself is not named that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's JAWN, just in case you're all out there looking for it.
Here's another thing. This is just a tactical thing that I do. So my first name is Rob with 2 B's. My last name is Dunwood, but it's spelled funny. So I regularly tell people how to spell my name, Rob with 2 B's, or I will spell my last name out for them. I know that when most people hear the Tech John, they're going to think the Tech JOHN. Why would you not? That's the way that John is spelled. Unless you're from Philadelphia, when you know that, oh, they're talking about John, JAWN. So one of the things that I do when I am telling you the name of my show, I will say, head over to thetechjohn.com, the Tech JAWN. I say that almost, unconsciously at this point, because I know that most people are going to type the name in wrong. So I actually spell the name out just so that they can get it. And let me tell you, once I started doing that, just the number of, I can actually, I look at things like the number of searches that happen after a show episode goes live. And the fact that I always say the Tech JAWN, I will actually Google trend that and see, I can literally see that thing bumps up, from Tuesday afternoon through Wednesday, because people are listening and then they're doing a search. So that's just another little tip that, we'll throw in here. As we said, this is one of those things to where we kind of go left sometimes, but I think that was just a good point to bring out. So we might have to make this its own clip at some point.
Yeah. Agreed.
So let's see here. We've got define your premise, on what your show is going to be about, who should be watching your show, why they should be watching your show, what they're going to get from it when they listen. We've got our title. We secured our socials, artwork. I see you just threw in music here. What is your thoughts about getting your music for your show as a tactical thing that you can do towards the beginning of it?
If you were using, if you're using YouTube, but if you're using TikTok or Instagram, there is music that you can choose from, and a lot of that is popular music. So if you just want to have popular music in the background, or a common sound in the background of your videos, because you want that little extra, I don't know, oomph to make it sound more interesting, or to make people stop and listen to what you have to say, you can get that all with those organizations, those companies. But if you're doing a podcast or a YouTube video and you want something that sounds unique, well, you could do a couple different things. There are people out there who will write you some intro music. I paid, I think it was $300 for a show that I did on Nintendo. You can also go to, like I said, Fiverr, Upwork. You could go into, if you have a Mac, you can go into GarageBand and you can make your own if you have that kind of a talent. But you have to have something to welcome people into the show. That's just kind of what people are expecting. Leave It to Beaver had its intro song. What was another popular one? Andy Griffith's show.
Cheers.
Good Times is a great one. Cheers is a great one. Yeah. Go ahead. What did you say, Rob?
I was just want to say, these intros, they do a couple of things. They basically set the mood for the show, but there is something, I would imagine there's some psychological thing with at the beginning of a show where you hear the same thing over and over and over again. If I hear, well, they're moving on up, I don't need to know anything else. I know what that is. I know that that's going to be an episode of the Jeffersons. If I start hearing if I hear that, and I'm not a singer, so I'm not going to try to hum this song or sing it out. But if I hear that, I know it's Cheers. I just know. And these are shows that have not come on in 30 years. 20 years, 25 years, or whatever the case is. But you just know that those are what shows are. So I think it's the same thing when it comes to creating YouTube shows, when it comes to creating audio first shows or podcasts or whatever the case is. I do believe, however, that brevity is oftentimes better. You will not, people generally don't want to listen to a 7-minute prologue, before they actually start hearing content. They generally are going to want you to get right to it. I have if we go back to SMR podcast, it has a very long intro. I don't know that I would recommend intro that long. Now, I don't know that we could change it at this point because the fans of the show so know the intro, and basically our intro, we had a good friend of the show, Chris Dutra, actually is a sound engineer and created, this intro for us, where he went and actually grabbed clips from, exciting moments, from years past of the show and put that into an intro. So you're almost listening to a trailer, so to speak. And it's not the length of a trailer. Like I said, our intro is generally only about a minute, but that's a little long, to make someone listen to a minute of music before they actually get to the content. But I think that it is always better to have something there because it just kind of sets the tone and gets people into the mindset of they're going to be listening to whatever show they've become accustomed to, that thing being at the beginning of the show.
Yeah, let's talk about the SMR podcast intro, though, because the thing that particular intro does really well is it tells somebody who's never listened who you folks are. Like, exactly who everybody is on that show, from Rod to Chris to North Carolina just became a country, like all of that stuff. And Robb's, those are, what did you say the gentleman's name was that created that for you?
Chris Dutra.
He captured the heart of that show in 4 or 5 clips with that music.
Yeah. And it's like, to this day, now, like that show has been running since 2008. I think we're at episode 616 or something like that, for a show that we probably do. This last year, we really, because everybody is super busy, we really pulled back, but we generally do about 40 episodes a year of that show. We've been doing it for a decade and a half now. But people know me by what had happened was. Now, that's not my saying. That is a saying that I'm not saying that I take credit for that. But it is something that I say so often that people actually know that I am joking on myself when I say that, because they hear that in the intro of that show. I completely tuned you out. That is Chris not listening to a word that Rod has to say. Yeah. So, so as fun as that is, and we said, do we want to change this? And it's like, I don't know that we can, man. That is, we've won awards for that intro. It's a good intro. It's a really good intro, but in today's world of people just not having attention spans, it is a long intro. And I'll make a distinction. Although it is a music bed there, it is the three of us talking. So you're actually hearing conversation that is introducing what the show, not introducing the particular episode. We don't do that. It is just introducing that here are the hijinks that you're going to get in this kind of show. And, like I said, if I had it to do over again today, I don't know that I would go with an intro that long, because we do get people who listen to the show, and when you're looking at your metrics, it's like, oh, they didn't even get a minute and they never got through the intro. Or they'll skip past the intro. I mean, you can, depending on how people listen, you can kind of see what they're doing, how they're listening to it. And I noticed that as we move further from 2008, when we started, we see more and more people who drop off in that first minute. And I just think that's because it's just people's listening habits have changed, which is why I would say today, I don't know that I would do an intro that's like a minute and 11 second long.
Right. Right. And I will say, if there was going to be an exception to the rule, your intro for SMR podcast is a really good example of an exception. My show has a 22-second long intro. I have another show with a friend of mine we're going to reboot in March, and I want to say that show is even less for the intro for that song, or for that particular podcast. So I would, between 15 and 20 seconds is really where you want to be. You want that key up. Like if you ever watch TV or in a sporting event, and there's a little chime, and that kind of refocuses your attention back on the ticker on the bottom of the screen, or the lower third, that's the kind of thing that you're trying to do with your show?
I'll give you another example. Let's go way shorter. What do you think of when I say da 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 da? You know what that is. That is the intro and has been the intro for SportsCenter for years. That's what the intro is. Now, you've got other shows that have done their own intros to their shows and stuff like that, but it's like, that is, okay, SportsCenter's coming up. Let me look and see who got scored on, who got mossed, who got dunked on or something like that. That's what's coming next. And a show that, that is, the show's been going on for years, but I just kind of took it over back in July. Daily Tech Headlines. The intro for that show, there is a 7-second music bed, and we do the intro of that day's show over that music bed. But I don't know that we could do the show without that. It's like it is basically, this lets people know what they're getting, and then we get into the Daily Tech Headlines, and we use the exact same bed to exit the show out. It's literally 7.8 seconds long. So it's one of those things from a music standpoint. You will hear a lot of people say, "Oh, I don't want that. I don't, I want to I just want to start the show off and start having content being disseminated." My experience as a podcaster, I've been doing this, as I said, since 2006. So I think I'm going on 18 years, into my career as a podcaster. I don't think that not having a proper show intro, I don't want to say you have to have a music bed, but I believe that you have to have an intro. At some point, you should have something that is telling people who you are, what the name of your show is, and what the name of the people that they're hearing on hearing in the audio or seeing on the screen are. I think that if you have not done those things, you have basically done yourself, your audience, a disservice.
We've talked a lot about podcasting. Let's move on to the actual, the video part of this, which I'm not as, I'm going to be honest, experienced in. But here's some things that I've noticed. I listened, I spend a lot of time on TikTok. One of the TikTok accounts I follow is somebody who seems like they were trained as a news presenter. She usually is standing in front of like a plant. Maybe there's some decoration in the background, and she has the camera set up a certain way. So every single time as I'm flipping through TikTok, if I see her, she always has really good information. I will stop, but I don't recognize that it's usually her. I recognize her background before I recognize her. And she does have a certain way that she dressed on most TikToks, but it's always the background that catches my eye. So if you're going to be doing something like Instagram, or you're going to be doing YouTube, you should have a set that you're doing this from, unless your particular show is about something that's out in the woods, then that doesn't make sense. But even that, I guess, is a set. But you should have something that people can recognize, because it takes just a second to scroll away from a TikTok or an Instagram post. What do you think about that, Rob?
I think that's an excellent point, because it goes back to something I think I said a little earlier. People recognize, like, you know what's coming. So if you've gotten to the point to where people have watched enough of your videos to where they know this is how video X starts whenever there's a new video. I have no idea what the video is going to be about, but I tend to like this person. I tend to like the content they put out. So when I see this background, okay, let me stop. It is almost like a middle marker to let you know, oh, hey, pay attention. Something that you generally like is coming up. And there's probably, like I said, I'm not a psychologist, but I would have to imagine that there's some psychological, rationale for why that works. Why do we know the SportsCenter jingle? Why do we know any jingle? Well, because we've heard them so many times, we associate that sound with the audio, with the video that is coming after it. Even though that those things may be very different, but we know that this person puts out good content. I'm going to stop and watch, because it's almost like a pattern interrupt. You're just scrolling through and you see something and it interrupts the pattern because you recognize it. You stop and then you pay attention. And when you're talking about TikTok videos, when you're talking about Instagram reels, when you're talking about these type of things, pattern interruption can mean the difference between something going viral and something not going viral. The fact that people notice it as you, oh, let me stop on this. And then the algorithm picks up, oh, wait a minute, we've got 800 people that like this. Well, those are 800 people who knew your stuff was coming up, or they recognized your stuff when it came up, but it's still 800 people. So now the algorithm is saying, oh, well, let's put this in front of more people because it is something that clearly 800 have liked. Let's go see if there's if there's any more people who would like it. That's just how the algorithms work. So I am a huge fan for pattern interruption. In a good way, when it gets people to stop and pay attention to the content you have coming up.
I want to do an experiment with you, Rob. Do you folks in Columbus, do they have Empire commercials?
Empire, tell me. I've heard the name Empire, but
I genuinely don't know. I don't even know what they do. I have no idea, but I can sing their jingle, which is 588-2300 Empire.
Yeah, I have no clue as to what they are, what that is, but I do know that I've heard that jingle before.
Yeah, I genuinely, because as you're talking, I'm sitting there thinking, that's the first thing I thought of when you said pattern interruption, and with the callback to ESPN. But I'm going to look it up right here because I don't know what they do. Maybe carpet cleaning.
Empire Carpet. That is exactly what they are. Carpet cleaner.
There we go.
1877 cars for kids.
Oh,
1877 cars for kids. It's like, you know what? I know the name of that number just because you hear it so often. It is like, this is the cheesiest commercial ever. But I tell you what, my wife and I got rid of of a car that you would call a hoopty back in the day. And guess who we called to come pick it up? 1877 cars for kids.
That one, most jingles don't irritate me. That one does, and that one's going to stick with me for the rest of the day. I don't know why. The organization's fine. It grades on every nerve I have. That particular jingle.
So let's see here. Let's just recap again, Bodie. So we've got define your premise, and make sure you're flexible when you do it. Define, who your podcast is for. Why are you creating it for a particular audience? Why that audience should listen to you, and what are they going to get from it once they do? Your title is very important. So you want to come up with your title relatively early on. You're going to want to, once you have your title, you're going to want to secure your socials that are related to that title. You're also going to want to look at artwork, that is going to be related to your title. And you want to look at music that is related to your title. So let's move into probably the last topic we'll talk about. This is a tactical thing that you should think about when you are first starting. We will have episodes where we're going to talk about how to record, mic placement, technique, all that kind of stuff. But let's just say that you have jumped forward a little bit in your recording content. Well, where are you going to ultimately host that content? So something that you can do relatively early on in your podcasting, or, if whether you're creating YouTube videos, whether you're creating TikToks, whether you're doing live streaming on Twitch, once you know where your content is going to go, you want to secure the hosting for that. So clearly, if you're creating YouTube videos, YouTube is your host. If you're putting stuff on Twitch, Twitch is your host, and the other social media platforms are your hosting as well. Specifically, when it comes to podcasting, though, you generally are going to have a podcast host. You can think of a podcast host in the same way you would think of a web host. If you were going to build your own website, let's say you're going to run WordPress on your own website or Ghost on your own website. Well, that website needs to run on a server somewhere, and that's going to be a web hosting server. Well, for audio, you want a podcasting host. So Bodie, what thoughts do you have on getting your podcasting host up front?
So there are so many different options, Rob. There's Simplecast, there's Castos, there is Acast, Podbean. What's the big one that I'm forgetting?
There's tons. Libsyn was like the first. Libsyn was like the
Libsyn's
first one.
The first one.
They're just like there are dozens and dozens, and actually there's hundreds and hundreds of web hosts. There's probably not as many podcasting hosts, but there are many dozens of them. Just here in the United States, definitely around the world, there are, probably in the hundreds, if not more, of places where you can host your audio. I have ones that I like. I would just say, do a bit of research. figure out what options some have. So, for example, if you know that at some point you want to do a private podcast, and a private podcast is one where you're going to put it behind a paywall, or you're just going to make it private where only certain people can listen to it, then it might make sense for you to actually go to a podcast host that offers that. It's not something that everyone does. So if you know you're going to do that and you go to a host that doesn't offer private podcasting, then you will need to use a third party solution to offer third party podcasting to your community, which is okay. Many podcasters, and I would probably say most podcasters actually probably do use a third party system for it if they've been podcasting for any length of time. But if you know up front you're going to have a private community, you definitely want to look at you're going to look at hosts that offer some level of private podcasting. Beyond that, pretty much every, these systems all tend to work the same. Like I said, I have my favorites on the ones that I've worked with, but I've actually had people say, it's like, well, how come you didn't recommend this one? Or how come you didn't recommend that one? It's because once you find one that you like, you kind of tend to stick with it. So although I have used probably half a dozen different podcast hosts, I haven't used 60 different ones. So I only tend to give recommendations on things that I personally have used and can recommend. So, and you've mentioned them. I currently have a podcast running on Acast. I currently have podcasts running on Libsyn. I currently have podcasts running on Buzzsprout. I currently have podcasts running on, running on Castos. And then I've used several other hosts. At the end of the day, they pretty much all do the same thing in pretty much the darn near same way. And it's just, who do you find that you like and you're comfortable with? But understand that when you make these moves, you're not locked into them forever, but they do tend to be long-term commitments. So, it is rare that someone's going to say, well, I'm going to be on this podcast host this month, and then I want to be on another one next month, and then I'm going to change again at the end of the year. Usually you're making these decisions for the long haul. So I say, go ahead, test them out, check them out, see what features you like, what you don't like, and just make sure that you know that when you sign up to one, you probably should be planning to be with them for at least a few years. If you think, oh, well, I'm going to get on this host until I get to this point and then I'm going to switch, that is probably not the best way to go about it. You might want to go to whoever you want to switch with before you actually even start, because it is not I have moved a podcast from one host to another before. It is not a trivial thing to do. It's gotten much easier today, but I did this probably 10 years ago. There's a lot that you have to think about, links and all that kind of stuff that, that get broken. Podcast players are different. You just want to make sure that whoever you're going to go with, you want to make sure that they're going to work with you at least for a few years.
That kind of goes into not just podcasts, but all of these different platforms. Like it's what benefits you the most, right? Another podcast that was actually built, a podcast hosting platform that was actually built by a podcaster, is Dan Benjamin's Fireside.fm. I've used that before. I have no complaints. I don't currently use it, but Dan does a great job. Dan is a well-known podcaster in the podcasting space. And he put a lot of things into this particular platform that he wanted as a podcaster. So if you value what Dan values, then this is going to be a good option for you, because he has expertise in that space. He's just not like, I'm going to make money by creating something. He went out, because he can program, and created something that works for the way that he creates podcasts. So all of these options are available to you. They can be very overwhelming, but what you want to make sure that you're doing is, and this, I cannot stress this enough, is if you are using anchor.com or you're using YouTube or TikTok, those are not your platforms. Those belong to big companies who don't care about you. You can get an audience, you can make money on these platforms for sure, but they will change their policies and it will affect you. Maybe not in a huge negative way, but like I don't know, it was like 10 years ago, Lindsey Sterling and a bunch of other YouTubers, YouTube made a change, and it really affected their income from YouTube based on that change.
I tend to try to be very careful with how I say this, but I don't want to say I have a problem with is this very strong way to say it. I don't want to say I have a problem with. I'm just very weary of free solutions. Now, when you look at YouTube, I have no concerns that YouTube is not going to be there tomorrow. No concerns at all about that. What I would be concerned about is that YouTube dictates how my content exists on their platform. Why? Because it's not my platform. It's their platform. There are a lot of people who are really not happy with Spotify right now. Spotify bought Anchor a few years ago. Anchor was a really cool, podcasting platform that you could use your phone to create shows with. Well, they just decided that, well, we're partnering with Riverside, and we're getting rid of Spotify for podcasts, which is basically the old Anchor. So people who were creating their shows, and you could actually create a quality show all from your phone with Anchor, that goes away in a few months. So there are now folks who are really scrambling and are upset. It's like, I can't believe that you did this to me. And I always say, it's like, you have to believe that when you are running your business and you're not paying for the services that you use, you are now part of somebody else's business model. And you have to really think about that. Spotify is doing what is in their best interest. They're not, I don't want to say they're not thinking about their customers, but they have determined that running this platform, that we're allowing these people to do these things for free, is not basically worth the bang for the buck that we are putting after it. So we're going to make a change. And now you have a lot of podcasters who are now scrambling. What do I use? I only have the ability to make my podcast on my iPad. I only have the ability to do it on my iPhone, my Android tablet, my Android phone, whatever the case is. So now what do? They're scrambling to go try to find another platform. Whereas you don't have those issues to the same extent. And like I said, I want to be careful with how to say that, because you can be paying for a platform and that platform also decides it's going to make a change. You just don't see it with the frequency that you see it when you're talking about free platforms. And once again, that is because, Bodie, you said this the same, the best way. It's like, when you are in their ecosystem, you're in their ecosystem. YouTube is making changes because those changes are what's best for YouTube, not necessarily what's best for you. When you control your own hosting, YouTube is not going to come to me and say, hey, we don't like how you're not hosting on our platform, and we're going to ding you. There's no one to do that. I'm paying a company that, as long as I'm not violating, the law or violating rules that they have put in place, my content is going to exist. They're not moderating that. I'm just able to put my content the way that I want to put it. So you always have to think about that when you are using free tools. And I'm not anti-free tool at all. I don't want people to misunderstand or misconstrue what I'm saying. It's just to understand that when you use a free service, you are now part of that ecosystem of that service. Their goal is not for you to necessarily be the biggest podcaster or content creator in the world. Their goal is for you to be as big as you can be while making money for them. Because trust me, they're not doing this at a loss just to be good, to be good stewards of the world. They're doing it because they expect to make $1 on the back end. And when things change, they're going to change things to continue to make those dollars.
Yes. And it is, if you're using, I'm going to use YouTube as an example. And again, just like Rob, I have no issues with any of these companies. I have a lot of friends that use Anchor, and I'm just finding this out with the Riverside thing, but I have a lot of friends that use Anchor for their shows, and they are very small and they are very content with using that, with that service. I've heard no bad things about it. Right. But YouTube is an example. If you build your whole audience and your whole business on YouTube, and then YouTube makes a change and you want to pull your audience away from YouTube to a different platform, extraordinarily difficult to do. If I'm hosting on Acast for my other show and this show, I guess. So Rob and I have different shows that host on Acast. If Acast makes a change, that we don't like, Rob and I could be like, cool, bro, we'll see you later. And we change to a different podcast host because we have an RSS feed. We can make that change, and not all of our audience is going to come with us, because there is some people that get dropped through the cracks, but most of that audience is coming with us. So use these tools for what they're most useful for, which is building an audience. And then Rob's big into building email lists, and he has converted me completely. Use these tools to build your email list. Use these tools to send people to other things that you're doing in other places, so that you are kind of diversifying your audience, so that you're not stuck if a decision is made or a company goes away. You have some sort of a recourse with your audience. Rob, you know Tasia Custodi, right?
Mm-hmm.
So she had a huge issue with YouTube recently. Maybe we can get because I know you know her personally. Maybe we can get her on at some point, because she had a huge issue with YouTube demonetizing her whole channel a couple months back. I don't even know if that has been corrected or not.
I don't know that it's been 100% resolved, but I don't hear people complaining about it with the same fervor that she was, in the latter half of last year. But it was absolutely an issue to where YouTube was demonetizing or suppressing the amount that people could make, and they couldn't tell you why they were doing it.
Oh, that's the reason. That was what it was. Yeah.
Okay, well, why are you doing this? And it's kind of like, well, because. I don't want to make light of the situation, because it significantly affected people to where when you think about how many people it was affecting, it's probably millions of dollars that was not moving for folks. But yeah, they were looking at content, and it was an issue on their end. They knew it was on their end, but it's like, hey, what are we to do? It's like only a platform like YouTube could do that. If it was Acast doing that, they could not just say, hey, well, do what you got to do. And it's like, all right, I'm going to move over to Libsyn right fast, because although I said earlier, it is a hassle to move, a podcast from one platform to another, it can be done relatively, in a relatively straightforward way. There's just hurdles you've got to jump through when you do it. But if you're hosting on YouTube and that's where all your audience is, you can't just say, well, I'm going to take my videos and go someplace else. You can but the audience is not going with you, because this is the thing that people need to understand about YouTube in particular. And it's not just YouTube, it's Twitch, it's all these things. The people who follow you are not your followers. That you don't own that. You don't own your subscriber list. You don't own that. That is owned by the company that you are contracting with to have your content on their platform. That is YouTube, that is Twitch, that is Instagram, or whatever the case is. So the only thing that you would be able to own as far as that is like you build your own social media platform, or you get an email list to where you can now move people through a funnel to where you get them from just subscribing to your content on a platform to now subscribing to your newsletter that you ultimately have control over. And we can definitely dive into that in another episode. But yeah, I do remember Tasia. She put out a video or two or three or four or five or six. There's quite a few where she was describing in detail how it was just wrecking the business that she had built up on YouTube. And it was of no fault of anything that she did. It was a YouTube issue, and that's what makes it bad in that way. It's like YouTube acknowledged that they had the issue, yet they were still depressing income and earnings for thousands of their creators.
Yeah, and it wasn't affecting. Maybe it was. If it was affecting Marquez Brownlee or somebody that was big like that, Mr. Beast, they have somebody they can call. I doubt that Tasia has somebody. She probably has somebody she can email. I don't know that she has somebody that she could call.
Mr. Beast, Marquez Brownlee, folks that, Peter McKinnon, folks who are making that level of content, not only do they have somebody that can call, if they were to complain publicly, somebody will call them.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure.
So Bodie, I'm looking at the clock. We went for an hour talking about these things. And I think we crossed off all the things that we had on our list. Is there anything you want to wrap up of Beyond the Post?
No, Rob, I honestly thought we'd go 30 minutes. I feel like we could go another 2 hours.
It's impossible with us. But now, I think this is good content. So I'm just going to wrap up. So basically, tactical things that you can do when you're getting started. The very first one is define your premise, and your premise cannot be, I want to start a TikTok channel or TikTok account. I want to start a YouTube channel. I want to start a podcast. That is not the premise. You want to be deeper than that, because once you get into the grind of creating content, you want to actually be creating content that you care about, and more, and as importantly, that your audience is going to care about. And if you're just trying to, well, I want to talk about this because it is popular, you can basically, run yourself ragged really, really quick with that. So define your premise and be flexible in doing it. You want to make sure that your podcast people know why you're creating it, who you're creating it for, why they should be listening to you, and ultimately what they're going to get out of it. The next thing you want to do is a tactical thing. Grab your socials. If or I should say, first, come up with the title of your show. What is the show of your name? What is the name of your show going to be? Preferably do not put the word podcast into it if it is a podcast, but come up with the title for your show. Once you have your title, secure your socials, because you want to make sure that even if you're not posting on everything every time you release an episode, you at least have them so no one else can kind of, encroach on your brand. Once you have secured your socials, start thinking about your artwork. Once again, if you are a podcast, try to stray away from using a podcast microphone as the primary asset in your actual artwork. Your face would be a really, really good thing. If you're doing an interview show and your name is on the show, but try to stray away from putting podcast in the name, and try to stray away from putting podcast microphones in the artwork. Music, very, very important. It shouldn't be long. Unless it can be a couple of seconds, from maybe 15 or 20, but you probably want to have something that is going to be fairly, rememberable, so that when people hear it, they know your content is coming up. And then the last thing we kind of jumped into was just hosting. Where is your content going to go? Now, if you're creating your content, if you're a YouTuber, the name, where it's going to go is in the name. If you're a TikToker, where it's going to go is in the name. So if it's basically social media, type of content that you're creating, you're going to be on those platforms. But when it comes specifically to podcasting, you want to think about your hosting. Where are you going to go and get your own third-party host that is going to host your content? And as I said, they all pretty much work the same way, but things you should think about are, if you are going to do a private podcast, if you're going to bring people behind a paywall, think about those things up front. It may cost you a little bit more week one, month one, quarter one, but it's a lot easier to do that up front than to try to, okay, well, now I know I need to get to get a private, RSS feed. I've now got to go and pay for a third party service that will generally cost me more than I could have done it if I would have done it all in one. Or you've got to move to a new host so you can support that. So those are the big things that I think that we wanted to talk about tactically as far as getting started with your content. But I will just say this, just start. I will probably say this in many episodes. When you first get started creating content, it is going to suck. How can it not? You've never done it before. It's not going to, your 50th episode should be better than your first episode. If it is not, then there's probably a problem. But just start. You're not going to be able to read every book and read every, watch every YouTube video and soak in all that information and think that, okay, now that I've watched 900 hours of content, I'm going to be able to create the perfect show. Consume the content like what Bodie and I are putting out to you, but don't consume it to the point to where it is debilitating you from actually getting started. So I would just say my last point, Bodie, was just to tell people to, when you decide you want to do it, start. It's not going to be great at first, but it'll be better the second time, the third time, the fourth time, the fifth time. And
I'll just add one thing is be kind to yourself when you're doing this, because there's plenty of people who might not be kind to you. So you might as well be kind to yourself. And build those relationships with the people who are kind to you.
All right, man. Good episode. And like I said, I think we went probably twice as long as we thought we were going to, but it's good content. It's good content.
It is.
All right. So thank everybody for joining us for this episode, and we will see you in the next episode.